At dawn, technicians lifted frost-stiffened brush behind a shuttered Lowe's Angels warehouse, revealing a sealed evidence envelope lodged beneath debris, its label faded but intact, carrying a date from Christmas week, years earlier, and the quiet certainty that something preserved here had waited patiently to be found at last now. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Lowe's Angels in late December moves differently than it does the rest of the year. Traffic thins in pockets, offices close early, and the city's constant noise softens under cool air that carries a hint of rain and exhaust. In 2002, the holidays fell heavy on the county, not with celebration, but with a disappearance that settled into the public record and refused to leave. Missing person flyers appeared on telephone poles along Olympic Boulevard and near small apartment buildings south of downtown, their corners curling in the winter damp. The woman at the center of them was 23 years old, recently graduated, newly employed, and expected home for Christmas dinner. She never arrived. Her name entered police logs on December 23rd, a date that would later matter. The initial report was procedural and restrained, reflecting an era before instant digital saturation. Detectives noted her age, her address, the clothing last seen, and the lack of obvious enemies. The city had learned to measure urgency carefully. Young adults sometimes drifted, and Lowe's Angels had a way of swallowing people without ceremony. Still, the timing troubled investigators. She had purchased gifts, confirmed travel plans, and spoken to family that morning. The pattern did not fit a voluntary absence. The search began with methodical steps. Officers canvassed her neighborhood, a mix of light industrial buildings and aging residences, noting security cameras that pointed away from sidewalks and businesses closed for the holidays. They checked bank activity and phone records, learning only that her last call was placed mid-afternoon on December 22nd. It connected briefly, then ended. No further use followed. Her car remained parked where she always left it, a small sedan dusted with grime and leaves, its interior undisturbed. By Christmas Eve, the case had shifted from routine to unresolved concern. Detectives documented interviews with coworkers who described a conscientious employee eager to prove herself. Friends reported no arguments, no plans to leave town, no secret relationships that might explain a sudden departure. Family members spoke in careful sentences, their statements reflecting disbelief rather than panic. The file grew thicker, but the answers did not. Winter in Lowe's Angels rarely announces itself with snow, yet that year brought cold rain that soaked alleyways and darkened concrete. Search teams worked drainage channels and vacant lots, guided by maps marked with red pencil. They found nothing. The absence of physical evidence forced investigators into the slow discipline of waiting, recording, and preserving. Every tip was logged. Every rumor was evaluated and dismissed or set aside. The case remained open through New Year's Day, through the return of regular traffic and reopened offices, through a city that moved on. In January, detectives requested assistance from specialized units. They re-examined her apartment, this time with a focus on what was missing rather than what remained. A single jacket was gone. A small envelope that once held personal papers could not be located. These details were subtle, easy to overlook, but they were noted. An evidence technician sealed collected items, labeling each with dates that would later be scrutinized. One envelope, containing trace material recovered from her entryway, was cataloged and stored. It did not appear remarkable at the time. As weeks turned into months, media attention faded. The local press, accustomed to larger tragedies, reduced coverage to brief mentions. Thanksgiving returned, then Christmas again, each holiday renewing the family's appeals and the department's review. Detectives rotated assignments, but the case file remained intact, preserved in cold archives where paper and memory aged together. Leads emerged and collapsed. A reported sighting near a bus terminal proved false. An anonymous letter offered nothing verifiable. The woman's name joined a quiet list of unresolved disappearances, each one representing a life paused without explanation. The investigation shifted into maintenance mode, a necessary phase where diligence replaces urgency. Evidence was audited. Storage logs were checked. The envelope from December 23rd remained sealed, its contents deemed insufficient for immediate testing under the standards and resources of the time. DNA analysis was advancing, but backlog and prioritization governed decisions. The envelope was returned to its shelf, waiting without intention. Years passed. The city changed around the case. Buildings were renovated, roads widened, and the warehouse district where she vanished became a mix of studios and startups. Detectives retired. New ones inherited files thick with notes written in different hands. In periodic reviews, the case resurfaced, particularly each December, when cold air and shorter days seemed to invite reflection. Still, no breakthrough came. In the late 2010s, a county initiative revisited unsolved cases involving young adults. Advances in forensic science prompted a comprehensive audit of preserved evidence. Items once considered marginal were reevaluated. Technicians opened boxes sealed years earlier, guided by updated protocols. The envelope from Christmas week 2002 was retrieved, its label brittle, its chain of custody intact. Inside were trace fibers and a small biological sample collected from a doorknob the victim was known to use daily. The testing process was deliberate. Analysts worked within strict contamination controls, documenting each step. The sample yielded a partial DNA profile, not enough for an immediate match, but sufficient for entry into national databases that had not existed when the envelope was first sealed. The profile was uploaded and cross-referenced against millions of records, including those from individuals arrested for unrelated offenses over the years. The result did not come quickly. Months passed as analysts refined the data, excluding false correlations and confirming markers. Finally, a match emerged, not definitive at first glance, but compelling enough to warrant attention. It pointed to a man who had lived within a mile of the victim's apartment in 2002, employed intermittently in the same industrial corridor, and later convicted on an unrelated charge that required DNA submission. Detectives reconstructed timelines with renewed focus. They pulled archived phone records, employment logs, and property records. They mapped the suspect's movements during Christmas week, knotting gaps that coincided with the victim's disappearance. Witness statements from the original investigation were reread, this time with names and faces attached to previously anonymous descriptions. A neighbor's recollection of a vehicle idling late that December evening gained new relevance. The suspect was located and interviewed under standard procedures. Investigators relied on records, not confrontation. They compared his statements with documented facts, noting inconsistencies that aligned with the forensic findings. Additional testing confirmed the DNA match with a statistical certainty acceptable in court. The envelope, once overlooked, became the central link between disappearance and accountability. Legal proceedings unfolded without spectacle. Prosecutors presented a case built on preservation, patience, and science. Defense arguments focused on time elapsed and memory decay, but the evidence spoke with quiet clarity. The jury returned a guilty verdict, grounded not in emotion, but in documentation and probability. The final outcome closed a file opened during a colder December. Sentencing occurred in a downtown courthouse, attended by family members who had waited through countless holidays. There were no dramatic statements, only acknowledgement of a process completed. The city did not pause, but a name was removed from the list of the unresolved. In the aftermath, the warehouse district continued its transformation. The evidence envelope was returned to storage, now labeled resolved. Detectives updated records, ensuring future audits would reflect the conclusion. Each December, when Lowe's Angels cools and slows, the case serves as a reminder that time can preserve as much as it erases, and that answers, once sealed, may wait patiently to be found. By the time the verdict was recorded in later summaries, the early years of the investigation had already taken on the muted texture common to long unsolved cases. What remained most visible in the records from 2002 was not a dramatic event, but an absence, a series of ordinary December routines abruptly interrupted. Detectives studying the file years later noted how unremarkable the victim's final week appeared on paper. Grocery receipts reflected modest purchases. A pay stub showed overtime approved for the week before Christmas. There were no signs of distress, no canceled obligations, no preparations suggesting flight or secrecy. That ordinariness was what initially misled the investigation. Lowe's Angels police in the early 2000s were contending with violent crime trends that demanded immediate attention, and disappearances without visible indicators often slipped into secondary priority. The victim's age placed her between categories. She was no longer a juvenile, yet still young enough for concern. The first 72 hours passed with routine checks rather than emergency mobilization, a decision that later reviews acknowledged but did not condemn. Protocols reflected the knowledge and resources of the time. Thanksgiving of that year had already passed quietly. She had spent it with relatives in a small home east of the city, driving back along familiar freeways beneath early winter rain. Family members later described her as distracted but not troubled, focused on work, and the promise of time off during the coming holidays. Those recollections were logged carefully, stripped of interpretation, and reduced to factual summaries. Investigators learned early to separate grief from evidence. As December progressed, Lowe's Angels experienced a series of cold nights unusual for the region. Meteorological data included in the case file noted temperatures dipping into the low 40s after sunset. Patrol officers reported increased loitering complaints near industrial properties as unhoused individuals sought shelter. This context shaped search strategies. Vacant structures, alleys, and loading docks were checked repeatedly. Nothing connected directly to the missing woman was located. One early lead involved a coworker who had offered to drive her home from a holiday gathering. Phone records confirmed a brief call between them, but surveillance footage from a nearby gas station later placed the coworker miles away at the relevant time. The lead was closed with documentation emphasizing verification rather than suspicion. Another tip suggested she had been seen boarding a bus on Christmas Eve, carrying a small envelope. Transit Authority reviews found no matching fare card activity. The envelope detail lingered, though it lacked corroboration. By New Year's Day 2003, the case had settled into a pattern familiar to veteran detectives. Monthly reviews were scheduled. Evidence inventories were checked. Supervisors ensured that no procedural deadlines were missed. The woman's file occupied a physical space in the records room, its thickness increasing incrementally with each added memo. It became part of the institutional memory, referenced occasionally during training as an example of thorough, early work despite an unresolved outcome. Years later, when cold case units expanded their mandate, analysts returned to the original scene photographs. These images, printed and stored in archival sleeves, showed little more than a quiet apartment exterior and the surrounding streets under gray skies. Yet details once overlooked gained new importance. The placement of a trash receptacle near her doorway suggested someone had paused there. The wear pattern on the doorknob indicated frequent contact. These observations did not create answers, but they guided renewed forensic interest. The envelope that would later become central was initially described as routine. It contained swabs collected from the doorknob and threshold, taken as a matter of course. At the time, DNA testing was expensive and selective. Priority went to cases with clear indications of violence. Here, the absence of struggle relegated the samples to storage. This decision, documented and approved, reflected systemic constraints rather than neglect. As forensic databases expanded, policy shifted. By the late 2010s, unsolved cases were reviewed with an emphasis on latent potential. The envelope was flagged during one such audit, its intact seal and clear chain of custody making it suitable for modern analysis. Technicians approached it with caution, aware that contamination risks increased with time. The process was slow, deliberate, and logged at each stage. The partial profile obtained did not immediately reveal a name. Instead, it narrowed possibilities. Analysts cross-referenced the markers against state and federal databases, eliminating thousands of potential contributors. The match that eventually emerged came not from a violent offender registry, but from a routine submission linked to a minor felony conviction years later. This indirect path underscored how time alters investigative landscapes. Detectives reassigned to the case revisited the suspect's history with an eye toward geography. In 2002, he lived in a rented room near the warehouse district, working irregular hours for subcontractors. Employment records showed gaps during the holiday week, attributed at the time to seasonal slowdown. When mapped against the victim's schedule, these gaps aligned uncomfortably well. Still, alignment was not proof. Investigators continued cautiously. Archived witness interviews were re-examined. A statement from a security guard, previously deemed irrelevant, described a man lingering near the victim's building late one December night. The description was vague, but it mentioned a work jacket bearing a logo associated with industrial services. Employment logs later confirmed the suspect had worn similar attire. This connection, while circumstantial, added weight to the forensic findings. The renewed investigation maintained procedural discipline. Detectives avoided public announcements, choosing instead to build a case resilient to scrutiny. They obtained search warrants, reviewed old storage lockers, and compared fibers collected years earlier with materials linked to the suspect. Each step was documented in updated reports, mindful that the passage of time would invite challenges. Media coverage resumed quietly once an arrest was made. Local papers framed the story as a testament to forensic persistence rather than sensational discovery. The tone matched the reality. There were no dramatic chases, no last-minute confessions. The case advanced through hearings and motions, its strength resting on preserved evidence and methodical reconstruction. For the family, the holidays remained difficult even as answers emerged. Court dates fell near Thanksgiving and Christmas, reopening old wounds amid seasonal rituals. Victim advocates coordinated schedules to minimize strain, a small acknowledgement of years spent waiting. Statements entered into the record reflected gratitude for resolution without embellishment. As the trial approached, prosecutors focused on clarity. They presented timelines that traced movements hour by hour, supported by records rather than recollection. The envelope was introduced not as a symbol, but as an object, labeled, sealed, and stored according to protocol. Jurors were guided through its history, understanding how something so ordinary could carry extraordinary significance. When deliberations ended, the verdict confirmed what the investigation had quietly concluded. Accountability did not restore what was lost, but it transformed uncertainty into record. The file, once marked missing, was reclassified as resolved homicide. This administrative change carried weight. It meant lessons could be drawn, procedures refined, and resources justified for other cases waiting in archives. In Lowe's Angels, where seasons blur, December still carries meaning. The case's resolution during that month reinforced a lesson familiar to seasoned investigators. That time, patience, and adherence to process can converge, even after years of silence, to produce an answer grounded in fact. Court proceedings unfolded with the slow precision characteristic of cases built on long preservation rather than immediate arrest. Motions focused on admissibility, chain of custody, and the reliability of forensic methods applied years after collection. Prosecutors responded with documentation that traced the envelope's handling from the day it was sealed to the moment it was opened under modern protocols. Each transfer was logged, each seal intact, each signature verified. The court accepted the evidence, nodding compliance with standards both past and present. Expert testimony centered on DNA science as it existed at 2 points in time. Analysts explained why the sample could not be meaningfully tested in 2002 and how advances allowed extraction years later without altering the original material. Statistical certainty was presented conservatively, framed in probabilities familiar to courts rather than absolutes. The emphasis remained on method, not drama. Jurors were guided through how a partial profile could still establish identity when matched against a comprehensive database. The prosecution reconstructed December 2002 with careful attention to ordinary details. Weather reports, traffic patterns, and holiday schedules formed the backdrop. The victim's routine was laid out in calendar entries and receipts, establishing predictability. Against that stability, deviations became visible. The suspect's movements were mapped using employment records, rental agreements, and archived utility logs. None of these elements alone proved guilt, but together they formed a coherent narrative grounded in documentation. Defense strategy relied on the erosion of memory and the possibility of coincidental transfer. Attorneys argued that trace DNA on a doorknob could result from incidental contact, emphasizing the shared spaces of urban living. Prosecutors countered by correlating the forensic evidence with opportunity and proximity. They noted that the DNA profile was not widespread or ambiguous, but specific, and that no alternative explanation accounted for its presence, alongside the suspect's unexplained access during the relevant period. Witnesses from the original investigation testified through records rather than recollection. Statements were read, timelines confirmed, and prior inconsistencies acknowledged. The passage of time was not denied, it was incorporated. The court recognized that while memories fade, records endure. This principle guided the jury's evaluation. They were instructed to weigh the evidence as preserved, not as remembered. Media coverage during the trial remained restrained. Local outlets reported daily developments without speculation, reflecting both the age of the case and the maturity of the audience following it. Many readers were themselves older, familiar with an era before constant updates, and responded to the story's measured tone. Letters to editors referenced patience, persistence, and the value of archival work, themes echoed in courtroom summaries. As the trial moved toward conclusion, prosecutors addressed the absence of certain evidence directly. There was no eyewitness, no recovered weapon, no confession. Instead, there was a convergence of circumstance and science. The argument emphasized that lawful conclusions often rest on accumulation rather than revelation. Jurors were reminded that the standard was proof beyond reasonable doubt, not beyond all possibility. Deliberations extended over several days, punctuated by questions requesting clarification on forensic procedures and timelines. The jury's focus remained analytical. When the verdict was announced, it reflected consensus rather than compromise. Guilt was established on the strength of preserved evidence, corroborated by records and supported by expert analysis. The courtroom response was subdued, marked by quiet acknowledgement rather than visible emotion. Sentencing followed weeks later, allowing for impact statements and procedural review. The court imposed a term consistent with statutory guidelines, noting both the severity of the offense and the absence of prior violent convictions. The judgment emphasized accountability without rhetoric. For the family, the sentence marked an end to uncertainty rather than a restoration of loss. Their statements, entered into the record, reflected years of waiting shaped by holidays spent without answers. After sentencing, administrative work resumed. Detectives updated databases, ensuring that the resolution was reflected across state and federal systems. Training units requested anonymized summaries for instructional use, focusing on evidence preservation and delayed forensic potential. The envelope itself was returned to secure storage, now cataloged as pivotal evidence in a resolved case. The quiet aftermath extended beyond official channels. The victim's name was removed from missing person registries, replaced by a notation indicating resolution. Community groups that had circulated flyers years earlier acknowledged the outcome in brief notices. There were no ceremonies, only the gradual settling that follows long uncertainty. In the months that followed, cold case units across the region cited the investigation when advocating for continued funding. The case demonstrated that time does not necessarily diminish value, that materials collected under one standard can gain significance under another. This argument resonated with policymakers accustomed to measuring results within election cycles rather than decades. For Los Angeles, a city accustomed to constant reinvention, the resolution served as a reminder of continuity. Streets renamed and buildings repurposed, but records remained. December continued to arrive with cooler air and shorter days, prompting reflection among those who had worked the case. Some detectives attended retirement gatherings carrying quiet satisfaction that one more file had been closed properly. The suspect entered the correctional system without public comment. Appeals were filed and denied through routine process, each decision reinforcing the original verdict's foundation. The legal record stabilized, signaling finality. Over time, references to the case in news databases diminished, replaced by newer stories, yet the documentation remained accessible for those who searched. Years after the envelope was first sealed, its role was clear. It had waded through seasons and policy changes, through technological shifts and personnel turnover. Its contents did not change, but the world around it did. When conditions aligned, it provided an answer that had eluded earlier efforts. As Thanksgiving and Christmas returned in subsequent years, the family marked them differently. There was still absence but no longer uncertainty. For investigators, the case reinforced habits formed over long careers. Label carefully, store securely, document thoroughly. The resolution did not rewrite the past, but it affirmed the value of patience practiced within the bounds of law. The city continued forward, carrying countless unresolved stories alongside those brought to conclusion. In this one, the balance tipped toward clarity. A disappearance recorded during Christmas week in 2002 had found its place in the archive of solved cases, not through spectacle, but through the steady accumulation of verified fact. The final phase of the case unfolded without ceremony, reflecting the way it had been resolved, through record-keeping, patience, and lawful procedure rather than revelation. Once appeals were exhausted, the conviction entered a permanent status within state records. No further legal action remained pending. The file, which had once required periodic review, was closed and indexed among solved homicides, its spine stamped with a date nearly 2 decades after it was first opened. For detectives still active in the department, the resolution became a reference point. Internal briefings emphasized how the case illustrated the importance of preserving even the most routine evidence. The envelope recovered in December 2002 had not appeared critical at the time. It contained no dramatic discovery, no immediate answers. Yet its proper labeling, sealing, and storage had allowed it to survive unchanged until science caught up with circumstance. This lesson was incorporated quietly into training manuals and informal mentorship, passed from experienced investigators to newer ones without fanfare. The courthouse returned to its usual rhythm once sentencing concluded. Calendars filled with other matters. Clerks archived transcripts. The judge's written opinion focused narrowly on legal reasoning, citing precedent and statutory authority rather than narrative. In legal databases, the case appeared as a concise summary: charge, evidence, verdict, sentence. The emotional weight carried by the years between those lines was not recorded, nor was it required to be. For the victim's family, the end of the legal process marked a shift rather than an end. They no longer waited for phone calls from detectives or monitored court schedules. Holidays remained difficult, but the uncertainty that had once dominated them was gone. Christmas gatherings continued, quieter than before, yet grounded in the knowledge that what could be known had been known. Thanksgiving prayers included acknowledgement of resolution rather than pleas for answers. The neighborhood where the woman had last lived bore little resemblance to its appearance in 2002. Industrial buildings had been converted into offices and residential units. Sidewalks were repaired. New streetlights replaced older fixtures that once cast uneven shadows. Few residents were aware of the history tied to the location. The city's constant reinvention had layered new routines over old events, leaving only records to connect them. Local journalists occasionally revisited the case in retrospective pieces about forensic advancements. These articles avoided dramatization, focusing instead on institutional persistence. They highlighted how cold cases are not static but exist in a state of suspension, awaiting changes in technology, policy, or information. The envelope became a symbol within these accounts, though always described plainly, without embellishment. Within law enforcement, the case influenced resource allocation discussions. Budget proposals cited it as evidence that long-term investment in evidence storage and database access yields tangible results. Administrators argued that unresolved cases impose a quiet cost, carried by families and communities alike. Resolution, even delayed, restores confidence in process. These arguments found receptive audiences among officials who understood the value of incremental success. The suspect's life after conviction followed a predictable course. Intake records documented health, age, and placement. There were no public statements, no interviews sought or granted. Over time, his name receded from public awareness, appearing only in routine administrative contexts. The justice system absorbed him as it absorbs thousands of others, methodically and without spectacle. Cold case units continued their work, guided by the same principles demonstrated here. Evidence audits became more frequent. Digital cataloging improved accessibility. Partnerships with forensic laboratories expanded. Each December, when the city cooled and the year approached its end, supervisors reviewed progress reports, aware that anniversaries carry significance beyond dates. They understood that for some families, time is measured not in years, but in holidays passed without resolution. The case's quiet aftermath extended into academic settings. Criminal justice programs referenced it when discussing evidentiary longevity. Students examined how procedural discipline enables future breakthroughs. The emphasis remained on realism rather than inspiration. There was no suggestion that every case would be solved, only that preservation keeps possibility alive. As years continued to pass, the woman's name appeared less frequently in official contexts, but it did not disappear. It remained in archived reports, court opinions, and training materials, each instance acknowledging a life interrupted and later accounted for. The resolution did not restore that life, but it ensured it was not lost to anonymity. The envelope itself remained stored under controlled conditions, its contents unchanged. It was no longer subject to testing or transfer. Its role was complete. In inventory logs, its status was marked resolved, a simple notation that belied the years it had spent waiting. For those who understood its history, it represented the intersection of diligence and time. Lowe's Angels continued to move forward, marked by traffic, construction, and seasonal shifts that rarely pause for reflection. Yet within its institutions, memory persisted. Detectives who had worked the case carried it into retirement, mentioning it occasionally when discussing careers defined more by process than by headlines. They spoke of it as an example of work done correctly, even when immediate results were absent. Each Thanksgiving and Christmas that followed reinforced the lesson embedded in the case. Holidays often compress emotion, bringing reflection and regret alongside tradition. For investigators and families alike, the resolution allowed those seasons to be marked by remembrance rather than unanswered questions. The calendar no longer reopened the case, it closed it. In the end, the story of Lowe's Angels, 2002, and the DNA hidden in an envelope was not one of sudden discovery or dramatic confession. It was a record of careful work extended across years, shaped by evolving science and consistent procedure. It demonstrated that even in a city defined by movement and change, some things endure: paper files, sealed evidence, and the obligation to follow cases through to their lawful conclusion. The disappearance that began during Christmas week had entered history as a solved case. Its resolution rested not on chance, but on the quiet accumulation of verified fact. In the archives, the file now rested complete, a reminder that answers sometimes arrive long after the questions are first asked, and that when they do, they arrive without noise, carrying only the weight of truth established and recorded.